Have you ever wondered how did we get to where we are at in human civilization? Let's hop right into it. The big three topics we are going to discuss in part three of the Summer Learning Lab series on belief systems are what I like to call the trifecta. So stay tuned if you're interested in diving deeper into the history, how we got to our ways of thinking in humanity, and where we currently find ourselves if you are interested in going deeper with the concepts of capitalism, patriarchy, and race as a construct. All right, let's dive in. I'm going to share my screen and I will try to get my tech correct. Um, Here we go. So, this is systems of power in our modern societies and how to liberate yourself. I will give a disclaimer that this is part three in a four-part series. In part four, we are going to go into specific strategies. So, if you're more interested in the doing, be sure that you come back for part four because that's where we're actually going to get into application strategies we're going to learn on and touch on today in this part, but then we will actually get into the how to. I'm going to share some personal stories of my journey of healing, etc. But let's ground in our anchor quote for this series, which says, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Okay. All right. So in part three, we're examining the current systems of power in modern society. And they have existed for hundreds, even thousands of years in some respects, but this is what is still, in some respects, not always, but in many ways, everywhere we look in our lives, we see these systems of power. They're systems designed to oppress and control humankind, members of the human race, and they have been on our planet for a number of years, many, many years. If you're more interested in how some different religious traditions and ancestral belief systems came about, be sure to go back to part one, where we dive into a little bit of that. And in this one, again, we're examining what I call the trifecta. We're about to get to it. And I wanted to cite this quote that I shared last session as well. It's from the text, "Don't believe everything you think." And it says, "What we do not question controls us. What we question frees us." So there are some days, I have to be honest with you all, as a cultural psychology researcher, there are many days I have spent, whether I'm amidst traveling, speaking engagements, facilitations, etc., there's a lot of in between where I have time to think and be in space. So I find myself asking me a lot of questions. I have been told by different people in my world, I don't know if you can relate, please comment below if you can, but I've had people just say, "What are you talking about? An inner voice or an inner compass?" And that is how so much of my work has come about over the past decade as a researcher in applied cultural psychology. I look at and get to study, why do we think the way we do? And then how do those behaviors manifest into our everyday life, all stemming from our psychology as it relates to our relationship with culture, which is our norms, our beliefs, our values, symbols, and language that's important to us. And these are all things that, quite frankly, this is still a newer field in the past couple hundred years of psychology. So let's get to the trifecta. What do I call the trifecta and why? I am not naming every system. There is no possible way I could. I've shared this even in the first session, I think it was. We absolutely did not explore every single religious system. I mean, there are so many. So the trifecta, as I call it, are our current most harmful systems of oppression that actually are layered together. They're working in tandem with each other, and they are to produce a certain set of outputs. And so to get to outputs, just like any formula, when we want to get to certain outputs and goals, and then we have to have certain inputs. And one way that this has been done in humanity for thousands of years is underneath what isn't said out loud. and giving the illusion, right? So we are in an illusion often of what we perceive as power. Why? Because when we're birthed into the world, we're birthed into the existing systems. And for many of us as humans, we are trying to survive. And the people, the powers that be that do not intend the good of humanity, they prey upon people, humans, who they want to be better. They want to grow and learn. And because of that, it has required through the ages much more sophisticated methods of not only mind control, but attempting to steal spirit and soul, or pieces of spirit and soul, from humanity. Why? Because every input produces an output. So if I'm a person who I want to be king, you see my little graphic, I want to feel like a king, or I want to be in control of everything, and I am motivated by greed, I would have to create systems and structures culturally that actually oppress and harm others, because greed isn't coming from a place of love. We'll get to that in a minute, because part of the work and research that I do heavily is influenced and informed by emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence isn't just your EQ and your ability to be aware of yourself. It's also the understanding that we are all one in the universe, and we are all deeply intertwined and connected. And when we know that, and we know the power that each of us even have individually, we are unstoppable as not only individuals, but as a collective, as communities, as a village, quote unquote. So, what better way to control and shame humans and keep them stuck in constant cycle or thought loop patterns of feeling not good enough? What are the ways that are often out of control when you're born, right? They are out of your control when you're born into this world. Things like your skin color, things like how much money your parents have, things like if you are a woman or a man, you might get to do this or that. So, rules that have already been developed or created by someone who said, I do not want to give up power. And I somehow think that I should have all this land, or I should have all of this money, or I should keep this illusion going, because why? You are thinking of one individual or one group of people, whatever, that thinking of greed really, really impacts humanity. And underneath greed is really just fear. So we'll come back to that concept momentarily. But I want to point out that a caste system is is dictated. We often have heard that word in specific societies and cultures through the centuries. A caste system is a system of control, and it's a system purely built on hierarchies. Most of these hierarchies are just made up by a very small handful of beings who, again, feel they have the right, authority, entitlement, etc., whatever, to just make this up. Or better yet, it's not even that deep. Many of them aren't even that smart at all. They look for people that they can prey upon, that are willing, and not because they want to be, but because they're desperate for their lives. So they look at ways that they can prey on people, these systems do, that are essentially created by beings who want to be in power and stay in power. They have manipulated things like education, religion. They've created entire systems, offshoots of systems from these core kind of concepts. And I chose these three to zone in on because I do feel that the intersection of all three, how they work together, I feel it's been the script, so to speak, that has been ruling so much of humanity for centuries, even millennia. So capitalism is a monetary caste system. Socioeconomic status or class, wanting to know how much people make. Governments trying to control what you actually can take home to your family and what you need to, quote unquote, pay to Caesar. I often have heard, by the way, Westernized Christians, those who claim Christ in the West, mainly North America as a continent, if we're speaking, they often use this quote, well, you got to pay Caesar. I've never really understood it. Like, why? Okay. And when I've actually asked people why, first of all, they get mad. They think I'm being a heretic and not following the word of God. Whatever things they regurgitate or have maybe heard in a few sermons throughout their life, they then build their entire life and belief system on this. And this is what systems like capitalism, when it's then intertwined with educational and religious institutions, government institutions, etc., and you have all those things working, what are you doing to people's minds and hearts? You're controlling them, or you want to at least feel like you are. The reality is, all of us can be free if we want as humans. We can, even if it doesn't always feel like it. And I know intimately what that feels like and the dissonance that even talking about this can bring up for myself in my own journey, whether that has been my own financial struggles through the years, whether it has been my own shortcomings of not feeling enough because I'm a woman, or maybe I don't feel like I can identify in certain ways with certain groups of people because my skin tone is a certain way. These are all things that are so deeply elemental to the human experience and so much that we cannot control. How do you really still control and shame people when they figure out the people who created a lot of this stuff, they're not that bright. They just want power. They're power hungry. They have learned how to step on people, and their families have been doing it for centuries. How do you navigate that? Well, by saying that's not true. You made it up. And we're living at a high time of this now, especially because of corporate greed and corporate structures that reflect this little icon at the bottom. It is, let me control you. Let me do with you what I want. You're the pawns on my chessboard. And that is the tone that so many humans, we experience that from the time we are born. We see our parents struggle with it. We've seen grandparents and heard stories of ancestors that they've had these conditions because of monetary caste systems. So we'll call that capitalism. Patriarchy would be next, which is really a gender-based caste system. I heard this quote recently and I said, my goodness. And there was a time period where it was so touted on a gender-based caste system that in many societies around the world, it was said that even the poorest man or the enslaved man should still be afforded free help in the home and a maid. And so, what do you think came about when you really look at the timelines? I'm going to be specific to the United States. If you actually look at the timelines of when and how the institution of marriage, quote unquote, let's use marriage as an institution. Why is it an institution? Because it was perceived as an idea not necessarily built on covenant, even if that was the illusion given, even if it was filtered through a religious standpoint or holy scriptures of the word says to do this or the scripture says to do that, the holy text says this, it was actually informed by empire. So governments and those who wanted to amass wealth and land. And this is when we see colonization come online. This is when we see more sophisticated tactics for justifying why I'm going to take that from you, even though you worked for it, even though it's your birthright. To be born into the human race is a birthright of abundance because everything and more has been given to planet Earth. Everything we need and more was already in existence. And when that became corporatized, and we put capitalism with patriarchy, and we've layered these systems through the ages, we now have corporate greed, which says, I'm going to take from you because I'm this big healthcare company. Oh, and by the way, you're going to pay me thousands of dollars every year just because you're afraid something might happen to you. So we get systems like marriage that were created for men to ensure that they had land, for men to ensure that they had a reason for their daughters to still exist. If you look into the Salem witch trials, let's do another example. The Salem witch trials, United States-based context. Was there really a hubbub because people believed that single women were witches? No, they were very specific witches, quote unquote. They were specifically females who were the only heir to their mother and father, the only heir to their father's land. And the government said if this female is not married, even if she's the only heir, we don't want her to have, she doesn't get to have that. So we have this whole system of justifying why control needs to be held from human to human. And then we make the systems make people believe, just like it might make men think a certain way, and women, some of us are the worst perpetrators of upholding patriarchal oppressive systems. And not even because they benefit us, but because we've been brainwashed. We have been programmed. And we say, oh, well, that's just the way things are. Nope. It's the way that the systems and the powers that be want you to believe things are, so that you continue to bow down and give consent. Racial classification, which is a skin tone based caste system based on our appearances. We all are aware over time of the global conditions of race and colorism, how this showed up in apartheid, in modern day United States, in enslavement of countries and colonies, colonization that still happens. One of my motherlands, Borican, Puerto Rico, is still just celebrated 128 years of colonization, aka enslavement, by the United States, and wanting to set up military bases and basically bastardize all of the resources on the island from the people to benefit the United States, while taking away consistently the rights and even access to things like clean drinking water and air conditioning for when there's extreme heat conditions. It's made it nearly impossible for many of even some of my relatives to consider ever being able to survive and live on the island. And that's why you also see a mass exodus. If you don't know a lot about geography or history, that's okay. That's why you do see a mass exodus and migration pattern from certain places, because there's strategies that have been used throughout the ages. They're not new, they're not American, they've been used throughout the ages to control and dominate people. So when you run out of ideas or ways to make up war and create war so that you can invade someplace, that is when you see more of these systems become more sophisticated. And it really has done a number on how we judge each other and how we judge ourselves even. I've struggled with some colorism issues myself because I was constantly asked as a kid where I grew up, what are you? Why is your last name González? I still get told these things, and it doesn't matter who the other person is calling me names or whatever. That's not the part even that bothers me. It's the part what led me into being a cultural psychology researcher is, why are we so quick as humans to just accept that? Why do we think it would be okay to judge somebody based on how their DNA descended and how my DNA has presented itself? Why do we think that that would be okay to judge somebody on the basis of their skin tone, to judge somebody based on an arbitrary system made up by, once again, humans, beings that have one goal, which is greed and ultimate absolute power? Absolute power corrupts, my friends. Okay, what are the inputs then to get outputs like to keep people in power? This is what they're doing. We're seeing it happen in real time around the world right now. We're in a really critical time in history, but also really exciting, because we are getting to start to see some of these systems crumble. And so many humans, we are having this awakening and saying, what? Wait a minute, that law exists in that state and it's telling you to do what with your body? Oh my goodness, what? Who decided that could be okay? Who said that that person was in charge just because they paid somebody off to get elected? What? And so we're in that era where I think it's beautiful. So I see so many people asking questions, and that excites me. But if I'm a person in power and I'm like, well, if I'm one of the big families that owns one of the big worldwide food corporations that poisons people, that shares processed foods, that doesn't really test it, and we all know what some of them are, then what would I look for? Total dependency. So I would go for things like starvation, ways to starve out people, ways to create issues with food supply systems so that people have to be dependent, or they have the illusion, and from fear, they say, okay, well, I have to do this and I have to depend on the government, or I have to depend on my church, or I have to depend on school, or I have to depend on this marriage. You see how we lean on those institutions and say, There couldn't possibly be another way. And when we do that, we actually kill off any pieces of faith, pure faith in the great creator and the divine that we have access to. And we can't see it any other way. I know it, and I'm preaching to myself right now. Homelessness, abuse, enslavement mindsets, reinforced by institutionalized systems like education, religion, law, and government. So it becomes this multi-conglomerate attack on each individual human and also on greater communities, specific communities based on race, based on gender, based on monetary status. And so then you feel as though you're actually having to figure out how to navigate this really complex obstacle course. And none of it's you. And none of it is how you were fearfully and wonderfully made. The inputs that get those outputs are things like very intentional division, destruction, displacement, and underneath it all is fear. So if I can make people afraid, then I can drive them to do pretty much anything I want and not really think for themselves. So one of the biggest problems that I see, not only from surveying thousands of people through the years and studying thought processes, but also having my own lived experiences throughout time in my life. I'm 41 years old. I was born and raised in a very fundamentalist Baptist church. It was very cult-like. What we were and not allowed to do, we were and weren't allowed to do. But I had a saving grace in that I was also exposed a lot to Puerto Rican culture. My parents allowed me to read a lot of books as a kid. We went to the library a lot. And there were other avenues I had, like music. Those are privileges that I had access to. My parents were very intentional about. And then on my mom's side, I had grandparents who were Amish and Mennonite, and they had left that tradition at some point. My grandfather had left the island of Puerto Rico when he was 16 and moved to Chicago. He was part of that mass exodus after the resources were depleted, and they forced men to be called into the United States Army for the World Wars. So even that, most of the citizens of Puerto Rico, we don't have the same rights as mainland people in the States because we're still colonized. So, and I say we because I have many family there still. I was not born and raised there though. Um, but even hearing what people were willing to do. I mean, my grandfather had like a second grade reading level, maybe. He was not fluent in English, and it was so bad. He came to Chicago to try to start a new life. And thank God he did, you know, but those sources, so we're often deriving our belief systems and how we run our lives, these scripts underneath our lives outside of personality. That's part two. If you're interested in more like personality, the psychological lens, and how we show up and how that influences beliefs. But we often then, those belief systems that we're introduced to, they end up sometimes being harmful or more harmful than if we were just purely saying, I'm going to operate out of evil and greed and fear because we believe that they are systems of love and unconditional love, and it's presented that way to us. Or this system is designed to help you excel at your studies. We want to believe that about educational institutions, but the reality is schools are a way to control national agendas for governments and to also prepare and shape the workforce, aka students, young kids, into the workers that you think or need them to be when you're studying workforce gaps. So when you understand the systems like patriarchy or exploitative capitalism, racial hierarchies, then you can start to see this very consistent pattern of divide, destruct, and then we come into control and offer solutions. And when I say we, I mean, again, these powers that be who do not have good intentions and have been the ruling class, quote unquote, for many, many ages. And it's just been wrapped up differently. We could do parallels with the Ku Klux Klan, compared to Proud Boys, compared to MAGA, compared to apartheid. These are the same essence, which is greed, control, hatred, which really stems from self-hatred, by the way. Because who puts a white sheet on their head? Really? So when you look at a lot of these things, by the way, I talk about a lot of racial matters too, not only because I'm passionate about racial justice and those topics and matters of justice in general, but also because I grew up in the Midwest Bible Belt of the United States. And I grew up seeing many of these issues firsthand. And then I also conducted a lot of action research at the national what used to be the national capital for the Ku Klux Klan, where they had their biggest rally. And I was examining how much time it took to implement even the openness of teachers or educators in that community for trainings that had to do with anti-racism. I had a very specific direction I wanted to go with research in my PhD program. So it turned into also my own a lot of my own journey with reckoning some things from my childhood. And I wouldn't be who I am without the incredible books that I have read through the years. And one of my all-time favorite texts is Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. And he was a civil rights activist, a mystic, as well as had a doctorate, et cetera, did a lot of incredible things, especially in the Bay Area and all across the world, very respected and revered. The first edition came out amidst World War II, actually. So if you ever read it, just know that this is coming from the 1940s, the original text. And he says, in this world, the socially disadvantaged man, which is a majority of human population of 8.5 billion people, the socially according to these systems, right? Many of us don't wake up going, I'm socially disadvantaged. No, we are reminded of that by the systems in place, the media that's constantly sending us ads. You need this, you need that. No, we need to be at peace with ourselves. We need to love ourselves and accept ourselves. I don't need a bunch of trinkets. Now, I love my plants and my books, but we don't need a lot as humans. We've believed the lie, the illusion that somehow makes us more successful, and somehow we equate that with feeling better. And quite frankly, you usually feel worse if you haven't done an internal work to actually even accept the wealth or whatever the things are that you have. So in this world, the socially disadvantaged man is constantly given a negative answer to the most important personal questions upon which mental health depends. So my ability to even be mentally healthy to process my own junk, it's dependent upon who am I and what am I? And what did we say about a feudal type caste system where a little king is at the bottom and I want to control my minions like on a chessboard? Well, that type of stinking thinking is then creates confusion through those systems for each of us to say, oh, well, I'm not good enough to do that. Well, I can't fit in there because I look this way. And it leaves us in that spell, so to speak, of asking, well, am I enough? What am I? Well, if I'm not this and I don't, well, then what am I? And we see how these systems are not holding up. So I just want to also state that and proclaim that on this session, to be encouraged. I'm giving you some information, hopefully perspective or more questions to ask, but be encouraged, because what I do see happening and what I have found in a lot of my different research projects is we want to be able to grow as humans. We want to evolve. We want to understand ourselves and we want to understand others. We want to feel like we belong. And a lot of times these systems, even from a very basic standpoint, they train us to be beholden to a corporation or an organization. And what is that? It's still looking outside of myself and my own inner compass. It's still saying, well, I have to rely on this government system. Well, I have to rely on this educational system. No. Who told you that? And then you look at how laws are created over time, how they're played with. They always go back to the highest bidder. So underneath fear, I would say a major driver to always watch out for is greed, your own levels of greed. And then when you are feeling like, oh, I just have to have that, or, oh, I really need that. Or is that the greed of society and these systems, the greediness surrounding these systems that just made you believe that? And you're actually content and happy just as you are. So these are three questions that I do ask myself. And when you find or identify a system, how big or small it is, you can ask in your own community. Start with, for example, I'll give an example because I don't really care for my HOA. I've never had an HOA until the past few years, so don't even get me started. But I asked myself, how have these systems supported global domination? But this is why I don't like my HOA, okay? Because when I ask these questions to myself, I'm like, that don't make sense at all. Why are you doing that? Why do you think you have that power? Who told you you could do that to other people? We are all living on borrowed time and borrowed land, my friends. The next question, how are they still informing my own belief systems? And finally, who is impacted? So, little silly rant about a privilege that I have, which is I live in a space that happens to have a HOA. But that's just a tiny example. If you really are like, Justine, I don't want to examine all these big global systems. Well, then start in your own backyard, quite literally. Start in your own family systems. What are the things that are being upheld? And the bigger play behind all of this, I've given you specifics. And as we wrap up, if you remember nothing else, if you think of nothing else, if you ponder nothing else, always ask yourself the question, is this being driven by love or fear? Whether it's your emotions, your thoughts, your attitudes, your behaviors, your reactions, or the systems that you say, well, it has to be that way. Oh, let's go back to the quote. Okay. You got to pay Caesar. No, I don't. I actually don't. That's not the teachings of Christ that I'm familiar with at all. So then you ask yourself, what's the bigger play? Well, the bigger play is a lot of governments benefit from many, many humans being subservient and living in fear that something bad is going to happen if they don't hand over these exorbitant amounts of money throughout their lifetime that they work for. And systems continuously seem to reward that, then we all keep contributing to it. And that is how we get ourselves into situations where we can unknowingly be even causing more oppression. Why? For example, in the United States, where does so much money go? And it isn't our fault if we're lied to, but once you find a truth out, are you going to keep contributing to the lost lives of children? Are we all going to just keep contributing to pedophilia? When do we say, no, this is made up? This doesn't actually have any jurisdiction. And we are all interconnected. And I am just as responsible for the goodness of my neighbor as I am for myself, not because I need to control them, but because we should be willing to see ourselves in any other human that we meet. Even if we don't like them, even if they're not our cup of tea, I should be able to see someone else's humanity, whether I see them on television or I see them at a coffee shop. And we have gotten very, very far from that. And that means that we are all operating more with a compass of fear. It doesn't mean we're not going to have fears. I'm not being all rose-colored glasses and telling you to never respond. Sometimes our fear tells us, hey, watch out for this, be careful. Okay. But when you examine systems and what you're willing to believe in, your belief systems, your inner compass, and you really, really proclaimed and knew yourself. I saw this great activity. I want to pause and do it really, really quick. That if you haven't seen it, I forget the guy's name even, but I've seen other people do this. So one of the powers you have of that inner compass and internal voice, and many ancient mystics, many philosophers and scholars have known this through the ages, is to hear it inside and not to have to speak it out loud. So if we're in a big crowd or a bunch of you watch this all at once, and I said on the count of three, you're going to say, I am love. I am the I am that I say I am. And you know that you're that perfect mirror of the great creator. And you know the power you've been given to overcome anything, truly. Then you wouldn't say it out loud. None of us would. I would count to three, and I need you to say it in your head. So if you need to close your eyes, go ahead. When I get to three, you're going to say, I am love. You're not going to say it out loud. And I want you to listen deep within yourself. 1, 2, 3. That is a form of quickly taking back your own power. And I would say again, go back to the bigger play, which even though we talked some specifics in this part about the inputs that these systems create and then the outputs they're going for, because what happens? Dependency. I must look outside myself. I couldn't possibly have an inner compass or a direct connection to the great creator. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. And you don't need a priest, a rabbi, or anybody else to go through. Now, are these helpful teachers? Absolutely. I've had so many in my own life, and I know I will have more. But you don't have to be looking for any source of external validation. In reality, you don't actually have to. We believe these lies from the things like the trifecta and how it's made. We see it right now with AI. And AI, depending on where you are in the world, is received very differently. But when it's received with love and with clean green systems, you could look at China as an example, totally different. Here in the United States, we have lots of fear mongering around it. I'm not fearful. I have entire practices and channel called Teach Techies. It's all about the age of AI in education and entrepreneurship and how we implement these things ethically. I'm not afraid of it, but do I also know what's happening with those systems? Yes. They're taking your knowledge and whatever you put in there and they're selling it back to you and saying, well, you have to now subscribe to our system. It's the same things that have been done with air, clean water, land. It's been bastardized for resources and pillaged. And Mother Earth has been crying out to us for many, many centuries because of quote unquote the Industrial Revolution. Now you see the made up things about, oh, well, we need water to cool these data centers. No, look underneath it some more. Look underneath it some more because that is a made up story to create what? A king, quote unquote, a king or a queen who still holds the power. And we can point to a few key technocrats in the United States, anyways, where they could be literally providing in like housing and food for like millions of Americans. And they just choose not to. Like entire states could be doing better. But instead, we have this caste system where that one person, like a Jeff Bezos or somebody, is in that role. So this is not to disparage any one person. I just give him as an example because many people know who he is. And also the intent, right? How that over time, if you look at even the journey of an Amazon as a corporation to detach the individual, if you even look at that as a corporation and what they first started to do and intended to do and what it's become, you'll see that power corrupts. Power absolutely corrupts. So those two questions, if you ask yourself anything but that, unconditional love should be the motivating force and factor in your belief systems. And if your belief systems overall are driven by fear, ooh, let's get to work on that. Let's examine where those come from because again, so much of our world gives that illusion of, well, this will make you feel good. But it's really because it's about fear and harnessing that that very human nature thing of fear to get people to spend money, to get people to hate each other, all the things. So as a reminder, I'm Justine González. Thank you for being here on Love Learning You. In my context as a cultural psychologist, you're like, what is cultural psychology? What is applied cultural psychology? We're going all the way back to the 1800s if you really want to understand the concept of it, conceptually where the word came from. You have Geist, spirit, mind, or mentality mixed with, these are German words, Volk, which is a group of people who have common subjective views about themselves or a shared identity. And so birth was the process of Volker psychology, the study of collective and mental phenomena, or the psychological processes and their products shared by people. So in our learning labs, we have been discussing these products, which are organized religions and belief systems, our modern society institutions, and how that then manifests through things like education, political or religious systems, and so many more. And then we also examined a deep dive with human personality structure. That was part 2. So thank you if you have been here. Whenever you join, drop a comment. I don't care if it's 2030 and you're seeing this, make sure you drop a comment. I'm just so glad you stopped by. Like I said, I'm Justine González, and I have over the past 20 years been doing research and leadership work in specifically K-12 education settings, some corporations and nonprofits as well, but mainly K-12 has been my bread and butter so far in my career. And 2 truths I have found are that the existing belief systems in our world often are rewarding overwork, aka oppressive systems, but that introspection and realignment with your inner compass, each of our own inner compass, is a way to reclaim our agency and sovereignty and remind ourselves, I am, and I am enough, and I am love as well. Okay, so if you end up visiting introspectiveprofile.com, I haven't revealed this in any other series parts yet, but I wanted to give you an idea of the very simple personal introspective guide you can even just pull up on your phone. I still discuss, ponder, meditate, journal about these core questions that are part of my guide. And they are also questions that I have found to open people up most, so that many of my trainings, right, it isn't just jumping into, well, you said that and it was racist. No, it is, let's examine how we get to our ways of thinking and being and showing up in the world. And that is exactly what these questions are intended to do, and do that in small chunks over time and going very, very deep with each question. So we all have different realms of our life. For example, a lot of the past couple of years for me, my self-awareness has had to do with my body image and physical body health journey, because I have some goals with that, some health things that I wanted to take care of. So you might be on a journey. Like when I say on a journey, I don't just mean you have an arrival point. No, this is a continuous improvement process on steroids, our lives. And we need tools and we need colleagues and support that will also cheer us on, that will not always, they don't need to always be cheering us on, but they will tell us the truth, because the truth really does set us free, even if it pisses us off first. So that whole those 6 questions and this introspective practices protocol, it was birthed out of some of my teacher survey data and things just for the past decade, and finding all of the things that people always go back to. And I find that in my own journey as well, that the keys to the kingdom often lie in revisiting some things from our childhood. Doesn't mean they're all going to be painful or traumatic. It's just identifying, well, okay, you said that. How did you get to your way of thinking or believing with that? And just being an observer of our own mind and our own lives, being present enough to do that. So I hope that you go check out the Inner Compass Personal Introspection Guide if it so interests you, and come on back or check out part 1, part 2, or this part that you just enjoyed. I'm going to see you in part 4 if you come back. And here's who it might be perfect for if you see this. And you should tune in if you are the type of human seeking your own liberation methodologies. You are interested in somatic practices. I did say in part 4, we'll get into more of like, oh, how do you overcome the stress of like capitalistic systems, racial systems? We're going to do more of the how and the actual practices of being through somatic practices in part 4. And finally, tune in if you are curious about the neuroscience of your subconscious mind. We'll do a little bit more neuroscience type stuff with understanding the conscious, subconscious, and superconscious minds. So part 4 is our relationships with power via capitalism, education, religion, and other institutions. It's really, how do we keep our own sanity amidst those systems? So I'll see you in part 4. Take care.